howdy everyone. Happy Friday. I'm Jeremy Kitchen, Capitol correspondent here at Texas Scorecard. I'm doing my best to fill in for Brandon Waltons, the managing editor here at the organization. He is on a well-deserved vacation this week. He will be back next week, of course, so we'll do our best to fill in today. We've got a lot to get through in a short period of time. A lot has happened. For those hoping to have respite, to be able to relax post the 87th legislative session, which ended on May 31st, it seems like it has just been constant news since then, so we'll dive right into that, most notably of which Governor Greg Abbott yesterday took part in a border security summit that he had organized a few days earlier, took part in that seemingly all day, and then capped out the evening by giving an address, if you will, announcing several key provisions in kind of his new or improved border security efforts. So we'll talk through those real quick. One of the announcements, if you will, one of the more notable announcements was that he previewed what he will announce supposedly next week, which will be previewing basically a plan for Texas to build a border wall, which is interesting in and of itself. He talked about creating a task force starting yesterday on border and homeland security, composed of several government entities that will meet every 2 weeks from here on out with border region government officials and law enforcement personnel to come up with every solution possible to make the border safer. He announced that in conjunction with Arizona Governor Doug Ducey, Republican governor there in Arizona, he would invoke what already existed as a long-standing emergency management assistant compact, calling on states all across the union, if you will, to help, to send help in the form of drones, additional equipment like drones, air assets, boat assets, land assets, law enforcement personnel, and jailers to the state. And then he also announced that he would, at least giving provisional approval, he's still debating or deliberating the overall budget that was passed by the legislature, but announced that one of the things that was passed inside the budget, or Senate Bill 1, was that of over $1 billion dedicated or allocated specifically to border security. He announced that he at least approved of that section of the overall budget, announced that it would also provide for additional personnel, additional assets on the ground, in the air, and boats and things like that, and talked about how that would be allocated once approved over the next biennium to kind of help or aid in these efforts. What's notable about all this is obviously a lot of press coverage for it, but it was not. It can't go without saying that it was not necessarily something that was prioritized during the 87th legislative session itself. In fact, Governor Abbott announced February 1st his first series of emergency legislative priorities, and border security was not one of those. In fact, it wasn't one of the two that were added post the winter storm. And so it's an interesting dynamic that just suddenly it became this sort of emergency priority of his, if you will. Now, there were a few things that did take place during the legislative session. He held a few press conferences. Once the Biden administration came in, January 20th, whenever it was, really since that moment, and since he had at least publicly said he took issue with much of at least the prescribed policy of the administration, and kind of intended to continue to blame the increase in border crossings and apprehensions by Border Patrol and the Department of Public Safety on that, or to that effect. What's also interesting, I think, is notable in this regard is that there were several bills in the legislative session that were filed in the legislative session that were never even really granted the time of day. So Senator Bob Hall, a Republican from Edgewood, had a bill that would have authorized Abbott himself to coordinate and develop an interstate compact for joint action on border security and enforce federal regulations that are already on the books. It passed the Senate, but died on its way to the House Calendars Committee before a self-imposed deadline. State Representative Brian Slayton had a bill that would have created the framework for funding of border security measures to include a border wall, which, of course, as we just talked about, Abbott announced they'd be doing. It specifically would have required Abbott to obtain reimbursement from federal government officials, but this bill was never even granted a hearing in the House. And so it's interesting that, it's kind of this, as we enter into primary election or just general campaign season, that this has become more and more of an issue. Read into that what you will. I'm going to read verbatim a quote yesterday, which I thought was notable because I think it speaks to the overall messaging that the governor's at least attempting to convey, and that is, "This is something that is also not a tourism site for members of Congress to make an annual pilgrimage to and see the border and go back and do absolutely nothing at the federal government level to solve the crisis. Long term, only Congress and the president can fix our broken border. But in the meantime, Texas is going to do everything possible, including beginning to make arrests to keep our communities safe, to keep the cartels and smugglers out. We're going to do everything we can to secure the border." Pretty strong words from the governor on this. It'll be interesting to see how all these things kind of pan out over the next the next weeks and months, if you will, and see if the federal government does anything, if at all, on both the presidential administration side and the congressional side in response. And it'll also be interesting to see if any additional states join the compact that was even though it had previously existed, was just kind of given new life, if you will, to see if anyone heeds that call. So anyway, interesting stuff. We'll of course follow along over the next few weeks and months to see what pans out from that. We're going to pivot to kind of talk about another thing that's been heating up since the end of the 87 legislative session. Heck, we're 11 days out, and primary elections are already heating up. Before I get into that, let me intro here my colleague here at Texas Scorecard, Jacob Asmussen. Appreciate you joining us, senior journalist here. Let's talk about elections. I mean, these are things, seemingly we're not going to get any rest, which is fine. But this is something, it seems like every day we've got kind of this new announcement, if you will, happening on both the statewide elections, local elections to include city, county, and state house, state senate. Let's talk about a few of those real quick. So we had previously reported that the current Texas Land Commissioner, George P. Bush, had officially announced his candidacy for Texas Attorney General. This is, of course, something he had been hinting about since before the legislative session began in January. He finally announced that, I guess, 2 weeks ago now, if you will. This has kind of created this interesting domino effect, if you will, as they vacate seats and what have you. But he announced his candidacy against the current Attorney General, Ken Paxton. We had Supreme Court of Texas Justice Eva Guzman, who resigned from the Supreme Court this week. Many Capitol insiders, it's rumor, if you will, that she is also eyeing a position as a Texas Attorney General. So it'd be interesting to see if she gets in that race. Do you have any thoughts initially on that, or?
I think there's been a lot of political shuffling, like
Sure.
you said. You have George P. Bush, the current land commissioner, announcing for Attorney General. Then you have over here, Eva Guzman stepping down, rumored to be running for the same seat. And then, like you said, that's caused a domino down the line.
Sure.
Right now we have State Senator Dawn Buckingham announcing she wants to take George P.'s land commissioner spot.
Sure.
And then from there, you have former Austin City Council member Ellen Troxclair, the lone conservative voice on the council for a while, announcing for Dawn Buckingham's Senate seat.
Sure.
So a lot of shuffling happening. It'll be interesting to see how that develops.
It's interesting. So for those that are not aware, here in Texas, we normally elect justices to the Supreme Court of Texas. What has happened in kind of recent history is that Supreme Court justices for here in Texas will step down in the middle of their term, which affords the governor, i.e. in this respect, Governor Abbott, will be the one to appoint her replacement before a normal election would take place. And so we expect that'll happen here in the next few weeks, assuming she does get into the Attorney General's race. That would at least be three candidates that we can speak of at this moment, which in its own right is an interesting dynamic. To your point, for the now vacated General Land Office or Land Commissioner race by George P. Bush, Dawn Buckingham, state senator from Senate District 24, Republican from Lakeway, announced her candidacy officially this week, which is interesting. She joins an already existing announced candidate, Weston Martinez, a Republican activist from the San Antonio area who's run for things previously. He was already in the race. And then you actually had it was a Dr. John Spires announced yesterday, I believe, his candidacy for the Land Commissioner's race. He was a former candidate, I believe, in Congressional District 2 last cycle, and he, in that race. And of course, I don't believe made it. I believe there was a runoff. Didn't make it into the final two of that race. But all in all, pretty interesting in its own right there. Then, of course, for now, because all the senators are up for re-election next go around, Senator Buckingham she has to vacate her seat, which causes an opening. And to your point, we have former Austin City Councilwoman Ellen Troxclair getting in the race. It's rumored that potentially there might be other people that get into that primary race. I know the Deputy Texas Attorney General Aaron Reitz, who's was a former candidate for House District, I think 47 last cycle, had indicated via Twitter earlier this week that he was eyeballing the race and that an announcement, if there is one to be had, would come soon. So it'll be interesting to see kind of how that pans out, I guess. All right, so we'll switch to, we had announced, I believe last Friday, actually on the show, right, that Republican Party of Texas chairman, Lieutenant Colonel Allen West, had announced his resignation effective July 11th. So that in its own right has kind of caused some additional folks to get in the race there. Before we get into that, it's important to note for those that want to understand how the party dynamics work. It's very similar to the previous chairman before Lieutenant Colonel West, when he was first elected, James Dickey, and that because the chairman is resigning in the middle of his term, normally a chairman is elected by delegates at the state convention. This time, because it's in the middle of a term, the chairman's going to be selected or elected by members of the State Republican Executive Committee, and they'll be holding a special meeting on July 11th to select that person. As of right now, there's two candidates in that race. There's former state representative Matt Rinaldi, conservative firebrand, served 2 terms right in the Texas House of Representatives. He's announced his candidacy for the race, and then I believe there is a Mr. David Covey, who is the current president of the Texas Republican County Chairmen's Association. I believe he's also a current SREC committeeman, and I believe he is also the chairman of the Orange County Republican Party. What do you think about that?
Yeah, well, I think it's interesting to see former state rep Matt Rinaldi get into the race. Like you said, a firebrand, very much over the past year, been a vocal freedom fighter, you could say, just constantly firing missiles on Twitter during Governor Abbott's shutdown orders and executive decrees. Rinaldi was constantly criticizing, being kind of a voice for the people. And so I think it's a very interesting race, and it'll be interesting to see how it plays out.
It's an interesting dynamic in that SREC committeemen and committeewomen, there's, I believe, 62 of them. There's 31 Senate districts, a man and woman for each Senate district. And so ultimately the universe of voters is those 62 people, and I believe you have to convince a majority, right? Just get a pure majority to be elected or selected as chairman to at least fill out the remainder of Colonel West's term. And then, of course, whomever that might be, assuming they run for re-election, would have to run during the next convention setting as well. So it's an interesting dynamic, to say the least. Of course, all of this, not necessarily the Republican Party of Texas chairman's race, but everything else is pretty much subject to redistricting, which we've talked about previous, is who knows what that looks like, right? There's, as we've talked about previously, just to kind of add some background, the decennial census, right? Every 10 years, a census is had by the federal government. These are the people that come and knock on your door. They submit via mail, right, to get demographic stats and what have you. And then the census is that is the base for tons of things that happen, to include drawing of maps for a whole bunch of ballots or seats down the ballot, if you will. That includes state senate, that includes state representatives, right? And so we're talking about all these things, but who the heck knows once that's done whether these districts we're even talking about will look the same, right? To my knowledge, I think the last thing that, Governor Abbott had indicated is there will be a special session that's dedicated to this come end of September, October timeframe to talk about redistricting and to talk about some funding that they had received from the federal government. But all in all, I mean, who the heck knows, right? Any of this stuff can change. So, all right, I guess the other thing that comes with that too is that it also affects potential primary elections, which we're talking about too. I believe as of right now, technically scheduled primaries are scheduled for March 1st of 2022, but I think everyone knows that my understanding is those will be delayed. It's still unclear as to when those will be delayed too. I think the general kind of thought by most political insiders is that of either late April, early May, that sort of thing. So, all right, let's switch gears to local elections. We had a big story out of McAllen. Former Hidalgo Republican Party of Texas chairman, won the election for mayor there. Javier Villalobos, he was the first Republican mayor in over 20 years there. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I think this continues what we saw in the November 2020 presidential election, when Donald Trump surprisingly gained a lot of ground in South Texas among Hispanic voters. And so now we see the first Republican mayor in McAllen since 1997 gets elected. And so Democrats are panicking down there, saying that if we don't do more outreach, we're in big trouble. You had Javier Villalobos, the man who won. He ran on a platform of fiscal responsibility, responsible government, of cutting taxes, of supporting the police, right? And so it's interesting to see that was what Hispanic voters down there wanted.
Sure.
And so continues the storyline from the 2020 election, and we'll see what happens going forward.
I mean, this race for McAllen, Texas, got nationwide media attention, which to its own right, I assume it surprised a heck of a lot of people. To your point, right, talking about what was previously or historically has been a Democrat stronghold, right, very blue. Voting populace seemingly might be changing, right? And whether that's a Trump effect or just a Republican outreach effect or what, it'll be interesting to see how that dynamic plays out. Another heated mayoral runoff there in Fort Worth, I guess, on Saturday was that of Maddie Parker won over the former Tarrant County Democrat Party chairman, Deborah Peoples, who had the endorsement of someone like, former Congressman Beto O'Rourke, for instance. It was 53 to 47% there. Now, she was the former chief of staff for the now outgoing Fort Worth mayor, Betsy Price, who also announced her candidacy for Tarrant County judge, who would be replacing Glenn Whitley, who also announced that he would not be running for re-election earlier this week. What are your thoughts there? I mean,
yeah. So in the Fort Worth race, really, you had two storylines, right? You had Maddie Parker winning the mayoral race, right? The Republican defeating the leftist-backed candidate. But then the other storyline was that the Fort Worth City Council actually shifted from the Republican establishment to actually now more of a left-leaning establishment. So despite the mayoral race, the City Council itself is now more left-leaning, and we'll have to see what that means for issues like property taxes, right, or wasteful spending. Citizens will need to keep a close eye on what they do moving forward.
That'll be an interesting political dynamic to watch, certainly over the course of at least the next 2 years, for sure. So we're talking about local elections. Let's kind of pivot here. We're still going to talk about some local stuff. Let's talk about Austin. You had an article this week where you talked about a significant amount of money potential that was supposed to be used to curb the homeless issue, if you will, let's say here in Austin. Why don't you talk about that? What is that money being used for?
So the main question in Austin right now is, where did city officials spend hundreds of millions of dollars? Right. So you have this big homelessness issue in Austin right now. The story traces back to 2019 when the Democrat-run Austin City Council basically legalized unrestrained homeless camping throughout all the streets of the city, except City Hall, notably.
Of course, yeah.
And so this sparked a wildfire of problems, right? But during that crisis, the City Council was pumping a ton of money, over $160 million into the homelessness issue. And now, fast forward 2 years later, citizens are wondering, well, what did we get for that? Where did that money go? Now you have Austin City Council member Mackenzie Kelly, who was elected in large part because of the homelessness issue. She's calling for an outside audit of the city's spending on homelessness throughout the past 3 years to see where did we spend this money. And so that is happening. Meanwhile, the Democrat-run city council is now proposing to spend $515 million over the next 3 years to house 3,000 homeless individuals. And if you do the math on that real quick, that's over $176,000 spent per homeless person. And so that massive $500 million package is on the table. Meanwhile, citizens are calling for the city council to show where they've already spent the money.
Not to mention, I mean, there was a proposition just a few weeks ago that passed, right, that talked about addressing this issue. And did I see correctly, I think yesterday, that the Austin City Council decided that we're just going to recess for 6 weeks and not address some of these things?
Yeah. So while all of this chaos is happening, they're going to take a 6-week vacation with no plan to address all of these moving parts. And so,
meanwhile, if you're a citizen of Austin, you have to deal
Right.
with this issue, I guess.
Right.
Wow. Interesting. Another interesting dynamic playing out in West Texas, right? This is the Amarillo City Council. We've got a litany of stories on the website if you're interested in that, to talk about that. But it seems like this is an interesting timeline. Back in September of 2020, of last year, the Amarillo City Council voted to spend almost $5 million of taxpayer money on land for a new city hall. This is before voters had a chance to approve the almost $300 million bond in a November election that would fund that among any other projects that it would be allocated for. November comes around, voters rejected the bond handily by nearly 24 points, right? Sending a clear message to the city council. And then later that month, the city council decided to reject that altogether and issue certificates of obligation, debt bonds, right, for the project after voters had already turned it down, determined to move forward, if you will, at the cost of taxpayers. It's an absolutely fascinating story. What are your thoughts on that?
you know, Jeremy, when I hear that story, I think of the little girl from the movie Charlie and the Chocolate Factory who's constantly complaining, I want it now, I want it now, right? You have the city hall saying we want to spend $35 million on a new city hall, which is the largest spending package on that in Amarillo's history. And then so they go to voters and say, we want this money for a new city hall. And voters say no, decidedly, right? But now City Hall is coming back and saying, all right, well, we're going to get it a different way, right?
Yeah, they're using certificates of obligation, which ultimately is debt. It's bonds, right? It's basically future debt to get around what voters have now a few times rejected. I mean, it's a fascinating dynamic, very interesting going out there in West Texas. I don't necessarily understand. Okay, so we'll kind of pivot here, if you will, to a few announcements. So as always, I'm the host of This Week in Texas, a show that kind of starts the week, if you will, previewing the week ahead in Texas politics. Since the legislative session, just as a reminder, we've moved back to a weekly format. So look out for those episodes on Monday. And we try to not only preview the week ahead, but try to give you a kind of this is what's happening. And then, of course, we use our premiere show, The Headline, like today, to kind of summarize everything that did happen, if you will, in the ever-changing political landscape that is Texas. Obviously, as a part of that too, we've got all kinds of projects that we're working on as writers here. Of course, we want to clue you into. Of course, as always, we have our Texas directory located under the Tools tab, if you will, on the website. You can find out all your contact information for your elected officials there if you're interested in that. Of course, now that we've moved beyond the session, they're all at home in campaign mode. But given that there's at least, or they've at least hinted at, 2 special legislative sessions, it'd be important to continue to contact your legislator there to let them know what you're thinking about. And then I guess the other kind of big project that we've been working on is what we've dubbed as our kind of autopsy reports. These are our big overview looks where we start at the 30,000 foot level and say, okay, these legislative priorities, this is what happened to them. And we really drill down, right? Kind of this like microscopic view on like all the bills, the specific bills that dealt with it, where they died or where they passed in the process, that sort of thing. So I'd implore you to check that out as well on our website. Also located under the Tools tab, you'll see a little folder that says autopsy reports. We've got at least 6 up there. I know we both have written a few of those on there on a litany of issues, and there's still more to come. So if you're interested in kind of a more drilled down view on some of those important issues, make sure to check that out. And we'll leave you today with perhaps a subject that got less coverage and attention than really it deserved this session, which is that of foster care. So Brandon Waltons interviewed Mr. Brandon Logan of an organization called One Accord to talk about some of the issues that surround the foster care issue, if you will, some of the issues that came up this session, some of the issues he's been working on for quite some time. And so make sure to check that out. Of course, we will see you next week with another update. I appreciate everyone being here today. Thank you very much. But we'll leave you with this video. Y'all take care.
Well, in a legislative session with a lot of issues going around, one that may have not gotten as much attention this time, but certainly there were some important developments, is that of foster care. Joining me right now is Brandon Logan with One Accord. Brandon, thank you so much for joining us this morning, and give folks a little bit of an idea of your background and why you've been focused on this issue.
Sure. Thanks, Brandon, for having me. I appreciate Texas Scorecard for this opportunity. I started out my career as an attorney and kind of fell backwards into this area of law called child protection, representing parents and children, adoptive parents, in cases involving CPS where children are removed. I worked in that field for about 8 years and got frustrated with the sort of the system issues. I felt like this thing called the system kept preventing us from getting the best outcomes for children. So I went back to school, went to Texas Tech, where I got my law degree and get a PhD in human development and family studies. About the time I was finishing that coursework, Texas Public Policy Foundation was starting a new policy center focusing on child and family issues. And so I was the first director of that center, working in Austin on policy issues during the 2017 legislative session, and CPS reform was a governor's emergency item during that session. And so that was really a big reform bill got passed that session. Following that, I sort of went back out into the practice field to implement those reforms and those reforms broadly fall under this term of community-based care. It's taking the responsibility to care for children in foster care away from the state bureaucracy and returning it to communities. And so that's the work I'm still doing out here in Midland at One Accord for Kids.
I think that's a great transition. I mean, unless people are really involved with foster care, if you're involved in the program, you know people who are. I think a lot of people don't really know some of the issues. What are the biggest issues that face the current system in Texas?
Well, the biggest issues right now, sort of the crisis we're undergoing right now, is a capacity crisis. We don't have enough foster homes, we don't have enough residential facilities for children who are in the system. And so we've seen a dramatic increase in the number of children who are sleeping without a placement, including sleeping in offices and hotel rooms paid for by the state. We're up to, as of last count, last month, 282 children, unique children last month that stayed in a place that wasn't a licensed facility, wasn't a foster home. So that's really the biggest issue. And sort of that comes from all of these other issues in our system, which is, lack of foster homes, but at the same time, it's hard to get foster homes because we've got this lumbering bureaucracy that operates at a state level, and there's not a lot of accountability at the local level, a lot of transparency. There's a lot of interest in communities to do something about this problem, but there's not really a way for them to do that. And that's what in 2017, community-based care gave communities the opportunity to do.
And what is, if you can define this term, what is community-based care?
Sure. So community-based care, as it's been implemented, essentially boils down to a subcontract between the state and a local nonprofit or a local government entity to do the functions that have historically been performed by CPS. And so those include placing children in paid placements, foster homes, emergency shelters, serving kids who are placed with relatives. They're in foster care, but they're with a relative, trying to achieve permanency. And permanency is sort of this industry word for what the future of the child is going to be. Are they going to go back home with their parents? Are they going to go live permanently with a relative? They're going to be adopted. So that's kind of what community-based care is. It's an opportunity, but it ultimately boils down to a contract.
One of the big pieces of legislation that y'all followed this session is Senate Bill, I believe, 1896. What does that bill do? And that bill did make it through the process, so that's going to the governor. But what does that bill change in the current process?
Sure. So since 2017, you can pass legislation but the problems always occur in implementation. And so that's what we saw with community-based care. It was straying from the philosophy during the implementation phase. A report out of Texas Tech looking at the implementation of this new model of service delivery did not find good things. It found that the state was operating this in a very bureaucratic way, in a very top-down way, that although it's called community-based care, communities had no say-so. And so Senate Bill 1896 ended up being an omnibus bill that addressed a lot of things, but related to community-based care, it really implemented a lot of the fixes that were suggested by the professor and researcher at Texas Tech. And so those include things like originally the bill as filed would have just taken the responsibility of transitioning the state from this state-run system to this community-run system. It would have taken that responsibility totally away from the state agency, because the feeling was that state agency, CPS, was not doing a good job. As it's submitted to the governor now, what the bill does is it creates an independent office of transition. So it's a reform office to get this fix, this community-based care fix, implemented. And so that office will have a director that's a governor appointee. Another thing that it did is it created a joint legislative oversight committee. The legislature is really interested in this and getting this right, and stopping this from being a perennial thorn in its side. I mean, we hear about this every session, and nothing seems to change or get better. So I think the legislature is taking a more active role.
If folks want to get more involved in this issue, where can they go to follow your work?
Sure, they can go to oneaccordtx.org to look at our website and see the things that we've written, including an explanation of community-based care. They can also, of course, look at the testimony I gave during the legislative session. If they're, policy wonks like we are, they know how to get in touch with that information.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Brandon, for joining us.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for tuning in to The Headline. If you want to stay up to date with the news you need to be an informed citizen, be sure to check out TexasScorecard.com and subscribe to our email list. You can also listen to this show and other shows on whatever podcast platform you use. Subscribe and review our show now to ensure other Texans can be informed.